From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. The saying, like riding a bicycle, means once you've learned a skill, you never forget it. Maybe we were all taking that too literally when it comes to actually riding bicycles, because a lot of people are getting hurt. By looking at the data, the Star found that in the first year of the pandemic, there were over 7,400 ER visits from cyclists, with numbers up in many cities across the province. What's strange about that is if you ask most cyclists, the pandemic has been a boon to riders. And in Toronto was when more bike lanes were created and events like ActiveTO where the streets were shut down for people to get out and ride. So, it could be as simple as there were more people on two wheels, but it still raises lots of questions about how bike-friendly our roads and streets are. Ben Spurr is the Star's transportation reporter. Jim Rankin is a staff reporter at the Star. They recently took a look at cycling data and injuries in Ontario. Thank you both for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for you.
So gentlemen, you got your hands on some really interesting data. Where did you get it from and what was in it?
I can handle that part of it. The genesis of this look at bicycle data actually started with a question about traffic safety during the pandemic. And we know like car traffic went down substantially and other things happened that were related to the pandemic. People stayed at home, basically. So we asked the Canadian Institute for Health Information for data sets around emergency room visits having to do with traffic-related incidents. So anything to deal with traffic. So it could be a vehicle on vehicle, it could be a vehicle on pedestrian, it could be a bicycle, and they were broken down by type. And so what we got was several fiscal years to look at. So 2 fiscal years prior to the pandemic, and then the pandemic first year starting in April of 2020. And so we had a look at it together with Andrew Bailey, our data specialist. And what jumped out right away was that vehicle-related ER visits went down, as did pedestrian ones, but cyclists went up quite a bit substantially. And we had the data for select cities and regions in Ontario. And in all but 2 of 13, I think we had cycling related visits went up quite a bit. And overall, it was a 35% jump, which is quite a bit from pre-pandemic to the pandemic first year. And to give you a sense of the numbers, like in Toronto alone, in the years before the pandemic, there was, around 2,500 visits related to bicycles in ERs. And in the first pandemic year, it went up 700 to 3,162 visits related to bicycles. And in all the regions we looked at, it went up by 1,900 visits. So quite a bit. It went up. And then the one other thing that jumped out was that young people were more likely to be ending up in the ER room. And that's sort of the high level look at the data. And we decided to focus on the bicycle related stuff.
The notable thing to me is that this happened across the province. What I find really interesting is that bikes were a hot commodity at the beginning of the pandemic. Like in Toronto, the city added a number of bike lanes and held ActiveTO, where they shut down the streets so that people could ride. So it really felt like for the first time in a long time, people were actually starting to embrace bikes here. But, Ben, this might be one of the reasons that led to more ER visits, right? Like, what is the thinking as to some of the reasons why this happened?
Yeah, I think the simplest explanation is, as Jim said, I think when the pandemic hit and people stopped commuting to offices, for instance, a lot of car traffic went down. So there are fewer chances of drivers getting into accidents and fewer chances of drivers hitting pedestrians, for instance. But on the flip side of that is that there was, what kind of mini or even a substantial bike boom where a lot of people started to ride. And that was brought on by, I think, a couple of reasons during the pandemic, which is, for one, people who did still have to go to work when COVID hit were wary of taking public transit. So some opted to get on a bike and go to work that way instead. And also just as gyms and other kind of recreational activities closed down, biking was one of the few ways to get exercise safely. And as you noted, the city responded to that kind of increase in demand with cycling programs like the ActiveTO program, which shut down major streets to car traffic. And they also built out new bike lanes. So I think just the fact that you had more people riding that could, conceivably, of course, result in more cyclists getting injured. But I think there's a couple other aspects to it that are worth noting, which is this data, it doesn't just show ER visits of cyclists getting hit by drivers. It also shows incidents that resulted in ER visits that may not involve another vehicle. So people wiping out on their bikes or something like that. And so I think that bike boom could play into that in the sense that there weren't just more people riding, but there were also a lot more, we think, new cyclists, right? People who were taking up cycling for the first time or hadn't ridden in a while, parents buying their kids bikes because either recreation activities were shut down. So just having more people who hadn't ridden in a while get on bikes could be more prone to accidents. And one really interesting thing I hadn't thought about before writing the story was that also, bikes were really hard to get earlier in the pandemic, not just because demand was up, but because the supply chain was negatively affected by COVID. And so you had all these people who wanted bikes and often couldn't get the right bike for them or for their kids, right? So you had people buying bikes that may not fit them. And that could help explain where there might be more injuries, right? People, falling off bikes or having accidents on bikes that were, too big for them or something like that.
That's the one thing I wanted to just touch back on it, and it's the younger people numbers. I have them in front of me. Like the percentage change there was 67%. Like it went from 1,383 to 2,305 in that first year of the pandemic. Is there any other reason that we can point to in particular that young people were so much more, or is it just this sort of inexperience and perhaps the wrong sizing of bikes?
It is difficult to point to a single factor, but I think we can make informed guesses that I think there were a lot more young people getting on bikes. I talked to some parents who said, that their kids didn't bike a lot before the pandemic, but then once the pandemic hit, they were just bored and had, less to do. So they were riding around to meet their friends at parks or whatever. So I think we can probably surmise that it was just a lot of younger people taking up cycling as a form of recreation during the pandemic that hadn't done that before.
Okay, so there's some logical reasons for that, but this is one of these things that the rise in this number also points to some issues with cycling infrastructure. What are cycling advocates saying about these numbers?
Ben did a lot of the heavy lifting on this story, so he's more knowledgeable on that. But essentially, the cycling advocates, you can never have enough infrastructure. And certainly, Toronto did increase things during the pandemic, but compared to other places, and Ben can speak to that, we're far behind on infrastructure in Toronto. And then one thing we didn't really get a chance to tuck into is, we had cities like Barrie, Brampton, Kingston, London, Mississauga, North Bay, Ottawa, Sudbury, Thunder Bay. They weren't all the same. And so I'm still left with questions about, well, what does cycling look like in Sudbury? They don't have commuting lanes there. What they would have is dedicated bike paths that take you off into the woods, right? So it looks different there than it does in an urban setting. And we saw that Sudbury, Ottawa, and Durham saw the highest overall increases in bicycle-related ER visits in those 2 years. And we didn't really get a chance to dive too deeply into why, but Ben can certainly speak to the infrastructure piece.
Yeah, in Toronto, at least, you did see this response to the pandemic and the rise in cycling of the city building more bike lanes than it had before. It ended up being about 30 kilometers in the first year of pandemic of protected cycle tracks and painted bike lanes on city roads, which was a one-year record, or at least helped take into account some other infrastructure, set a one-year record in Toronto. But, advocates say that 1 year of kind of good progress on bike lanes isn't enough, right? That in the years prior to 2020, in that record year, Toronto averaged just about 5 kilometers of new bike lanes per year, which is pretty paltry for a city as big as Toronto. And last year, the numbers were much higher than before the pandemic, about 18 kilometers of new lanes, but that's still fewer kilometers than that record year. So I think what cycling advocates are pushing for, as Jim says, they always say that, it's never enough, but we need some kind of sustained progress instead of just kind of a 1 year boost in response to the pandemic. You need to keep building the cycling infrastructure until there's kind of a network of lanes all over the city.
We'll be right back. I'm a cyclist, and I remember the fights to get bike lanes in. And then they just started popping up all over downtown. Is that what is needed? Separated, dedicated lanes? And that's the other thing. There are a lot downtown, but I think that the suburbs are screaming for more bike infrastructure, right?
Yeah. I think people do say, and advocates and experts point to, physical infrastructure is really the key to safety here. There are other aspects of cycling safety, but building protected spaces where people can ride without coming in conflict with drivers is the most important thing. But you are correct that, a lot of these lanes are traditionally kind of focused in downtown Toronto, which makes some degree of sense in that there's more people down here, more people able to ride, and destinations between where people need to go and where they live are much shorter, so they're more likely to bike. Out in the suburbs, it's a bit of a different problem where distances between things are a bit farther. Roads tend to be busier, or at least sort of faster, wider roads, so potentially more dangerous. So there has been a bit more of a push to kind of get infrastructure outside in the suburbs, but that haven't seen as much progress as downtown. And that is really important because there are lots of people outside of downtown who do and can benefit from cycling. So providing safe spaces for them to do that is really crucial.
I think the other point that you guys make is education for cyclists and motorists about road safety. You mentioned the Netherlands. What do they do there that we might copy?
There's just more kind of robust education programs there. They basically start very young and give kids in grade school from the ages of 4 to 12 cycling education. And there are organizations that do it that basically partner with schools. But then at the end of this kind of course, there's an on-road cycling test that's taken by about 200,000 students each year. And it's kind of a big thing. And they get dignitaries and royalty, I think, to even give out the kind of certificates at the end. So aside from just giving kids the kind of education about how to ride safely and kind of the rules of the road, it's really just ingrained in the culture, I think, a lot more there of how to ride safely. So I think that there could be some benefits there. We don't really have that in Ontario. There are organizations that do provide courses, but it's not very formalized and you don't get a lot of kind of on-road experience as a young student and how to ride safely. So I think that advocates I spoke to said that is something that we should consider doing here because, just giving kids, young people, the education of how to ride safely, it will considerably help them, stay away from conflict with drivers, but just also kind of help them avoid accidents outside of major collisions with motorists. So it could potentially reduce some of these ER visits that we're seeing here in these stats.
So I love this part. You guys put a biking and road safety quiz in this article. And I have to say, I ride a bike, I drive a car. I think I'm excellent at both of these things. And I think I know what's going on the roads. And I'm embarrassed to admit how poorly I did on this quiz. So my question to you, first off, do you guys know anything about the overall results? And was there anything in particular that you guys really wanted to put in there to sort of reinforce? Because I've had my license for 20 years, right? So I think I'm an expert on the roads, but hey, we take a lot of things for granted when we're behind the wheel, I think. Yes?
So fess up, what was your score out of 8?
3.
3, okay.
Terrible.
So we toyed with the idea of having a bit of fun with feedback and giving people like a little cheeky sort of response depending on how they scored. And if you got 0 out of 8, we wanted to say you're a menace to society and don't set foot on a pedal bike or a motor vehicle. But we were sort of ordered not to do that by our editors, just to keep it more neutral and not be judgmental. But yeah, it's surprising because, as people who drive cars, you pass a test and you know the rules of the road, or at least you think you do. And then when it comes to actually being out there, there's a lot of questions that people really don't know the answer to. So I don't think we have a sense yet of the responses yet to the quiz, but suffice to say that we wanted to build in an educational component to this and have a little bit of fun with something that can be serious, But yeah, there's the contentious idea of requiring cyclists to be licensed. And the reasons not to do that are, there's good reasons. This is a form of exercise. You don't want to force people to conform to some sort of thing to get on 2 wheels. But there was one reader that reached out to us suggesting that, like the boating exam that you take once, and it's an online thing, you could do that with cyclists. And I don't know if that's a great idea because, it requires you to do this in order to cycle, but it does force you to learn a few things before you hop on a bike. But, I think speaks to the educational aspects that some other countries are doing a better job on.
So guys, I have to say I love cycling and I think that it's pretty safe, but this story did freak me out a bit. I mean, I ride with my 10-year-old daughter on the city streets until we can get to the bike path, but I'm thinking I might want her more on the sidewalk now just to be on the safer side. This has been great for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know?
Well, I guess on that last point, I do hope that, people don't take away from this story that cycling is inherently unsafe. I think it can seem scary for sure, especially riding in a city like Toronto, but cycling is, I think, a great way to get around. I think these stats point to the need to make it as safely as possible, but I hope people aren't discouraged from getting on their bike because I think as a cyclist myself, I find it really enjoyable. And it's also just a great way to get around that helps reduce traffic, helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions and that kind of thing. So I think it's an important way for the people in the city to move around. So I hope that people don't get too frightened of it, despite these sometimes scary statistics.
Yeah, don't be deterred. Get a bike that fits you and just learn a bit about the rules of the road and then enjoy.
Listen, I love it too. And I'll be honest, I think there's strength in numbers. So please, we need more riders out there. And then hopefully the city will listen to us and add even more infrastructure. Gentlemen, this has been fantastic for us. Thank you so much for your time today.
No worries.
Thanks so much.
Ben Spurr is the Star's transportation reporter. Jim Rankin is a staff reporter at the Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudder. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribing matters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.